They're only original once, and they don't stay that way forever. But this one somehow did. Hey, I'm Dave. Welcome to my shop. There are some cars you choose, and there are some cars that just kind of happen to you. Now, I'm a GM guy. I always have been, as is my brother and as was my father and grandfather before us. My life in Old Iron has mostly been measured in displacement, cowl tags, and assorted forms of General Motors' bad judgment, which is to say the very best kind. I've owned a long line of classic GM muscle cars, and so if you told me a few years ago that I was going to become completely obsessed with a 1970 Lincoln Continental Mark III, I'd have assured you that you would either mistaken me for somebody else or you would hit your head on the garage door. And yet, that is exactly what happened. It all started innocently enough, the way those things always do now, with a video. I saw footage of a triple black 1969 Lincoln Continental Mark III with just 12,000 miles on it from the factory, and the thing didn't do so much as catch my eye as reach through the screen and grab me by the lapels. It was one of those cars that forces you to recalibrate your assumptions in real time. Now, I wasn't looking at a luxury coupe from the Nixon era. I was looking at a time capsule, a car so improbably preserved that it almost seemed fabricated, like somebody had asked AI to generate the nicest surviving Mark III on Earth. Apparently, it had sold on Bring a Trailer. So naturally, I went looking for the old listing, because if you're trying to convince yourself not to become irrational about a car, the first thing you do is obsessively search for every surviving photograph of it on the internet. But I couldn't find it. No trace. Like the car had passed through the collector market, leaving only rumors and compressed JPEG artifact thumbnails behind. Then I found a photo on Facebook from a guy who seemed to have owned the car briefly at some point, perhaps as a broker. I reached out hoping to learn where that black 1969 had gone. He told me that one was long gone, but then he sent me something that somehow made the situation worse. A photo of an almost identical car, a triple black 1970 Lincoln Continental Mark III, with the same kind of absurdly low mileage, 12,000 miles. Other than the wheel covers, which changed from year to year, the car was essentially the same visual statement. Only now it had a few more options, and this time the interior was full leather. In other words, it was exactly the wrong thing to send at me. There was just one problem. He wouldn't actually tell me anything about the car. I offered him a finder's fee. I offered to use him as a broker. I offered, in essence, to solve his I know we're a very special Lincoln is problem by converting it into cash. And then he stopped answering. It was another dead end. Or at least that's what a normal person would have called it. But I had the photo, and that meant I had some clues. The background, the angle of the building, the vegetation, the lighting, the parking geometry. And so it was time to do a bit of geolocation, and I'll spare you the full descent into that particular rabbit hole, except to say that I eventually narrowed the car's location down to a particular apartment building in Florida. At that point, I tried the civilized approach. I emailed the front desk of that apartment with my very normal and not at all suspicious "I'm trying to reach the owner of a car in your parking lot" story. Unsurprisingly, they did not leap into action, and I never heard back. And so I escalated, which was when I began to realize this wasn't really about buying a car anymore. It had become a software problem of sorts. There was a hidden object in a noisy system, and I had partial metadata, and now I was trying to resolve that final pointer. If I couldn't find the car, I could tell I was going to blue screen. So I searched Google for local private investigators near the building, picked one with good reviews, and figured maybe they could at least locate the car and leave a note on it for me. Instead, they offered something much more direct. A dossier with the current owner. All for about $249, which in the collector car world is roughly the cost of a headlight vacuum motor and a medium lunch, and suddenly I had a real lead. The next morning I was in an airport with a cup of coffee, sitting in the Air Canada lounge, opening my laptop to find the report already in my inbox. Now, I'm not a phone guy to begin with, and there was no universe in which I was going to start cold calling some stranger about his Lincoln from the airport lounge. But I typed the number into iMessage and it turned blue, and that was perfect, because texting is civilized. Texting lets both parties retreat gracefully if this is all some absurd misunderstanding. Instead, the reply came back almost immediately and cheerfully. Yes, he still had the car, and yes, it was real. Yes, it had 12,000 miles on it, and yes, it was ostensibly for sale. And the price was $48,000, and no, he was not interested in negotiating. Now, at first blush, that sounds like a lot of money for a 1970 Lincoln Mark III, because in the collector market, these cars remain oddly undervalued unless you're talking about the truly top-tier originals. Driver quality cars are still surprisingly attainable, while the very best survivors bring the premium because they're only original once. Because Lincoln built enough Mark IIIs that they're not vanishingly rare, but not so many that a perfect one is common either. Hemmings notes that 1969 production landed at 30,858 units, and the collector logic on these cars has long been that buying the nicest one is way cheaper than restoring an ordinary one into something special. And so I told them what I thought was the only rational answer. The price is whatever he says it is. They're not making any more 1970 Lincolns with 12,000 miles on them. But at that price, the condition, the options, and the provenance all had to support that number. And that's where the story turned from a pursuit into archaeology. We texted back and forth over the next several days, and to his credit, he was patient and generous with information. I was trying not to be offensive because there's a fine line between serious buyer and forensic accountant with a steering wheel fetish. But I needed to substantiate the mileage, at least to myself. Any old car can claim to be special. The trick is finding the ones that can legitimately prove it. Now, he sent me the window sticker, the Marty report, the build sheet, and a lot more. And one of the things that makes these Mark IIIs uniquely interesting is how much of their identity Lincoln poured right into them. The Mark III wasn't just another trim package. It was a deliberate revival of the Continental Mark mystique, Lincoln's attempt to recapture some of the magic of the original Continental and the nearly hand-built Mark II of 1956 to 1957. The modern Mark III debuted in April 1968 as a 1969 model, and was very self-consciously designed as Lincoln's answer to the Cadillac Eldorado. The whole project reportedly began with a wonderfully irreverent directive to put a Rolls-Royce grille on a Thunderbird. And that sounds like an urban legend until you realize that it's also basically correct. The Mark III rode on a modified Thunderbird architecture built at the Wixom plant, but reworked with more isolation, more stiffness, more insulation, and a whole lot more theater. And theater is really the point of the Mark III. This is a car that understood branding before branding became the disease that it is today. Hidden headlights that popped up on vacuum actuators, smooth and silent every time. That upright die-cast grille that Hemmings notes was expensive enough to manufacture that it was triple-plated in copper, zinc, and chrome in 3 stages. A 5-bar masterpiece that cost a fortune to produce but announced the car from half a block away. The fake Continental spare hump on the deck lid. The exaggerated long hood, short deck proportions that measured over 216 inches long on a 117-inch wheelbase. The roofline formal enough to suggest that somebody important might step out of it, but rakish enough that he probably owned a second house and maybe even a color television. The Mark III was not trying to be subtle. It was trying to look inevitable. And under the hood, it had the hardware to back up at least some of that attitude. The Mark III's 460 cubic inch V8 was rated at 365 horsepower and 500 pound-feet of torque in period gross figures, fed through a Motorcraft 4300 4-barrel carburetor and a C6 select shift 3-speed automatic. That 460 was no afterthought. It was Ford's biggest passenger car engine of the era, a bored and stroked evolution of the 429 with a 436-inch bore and a 359-inch stroke, 10.5-to-1 compression, and a cast iron block that could shrug off years of abuse. No, this was not a canyon carver. Nothing weighing 4,900 pounds and measuring over 216 inches long is ever going to feel like a Corvette. But that was never the assignment. The assignment was effortless authority. Lincoln delivered a car that could waft down the interstate with a sort of serene indifference usually associated with expensive hotel lobbies and well-managed trust funds. This particular example was ordered with a cross-country ride package, which included firmer shocks, heavier springs, and revised valving that gave the car a tad more road feel and grip without sacrificing that famous Lincoln float. By 1970, the car had gotten even more interesting. Lincoln added concealed windshield wipers that tucked neatly under a flush cowl panel for a cleaner aerodynamics and a smoother look, revised some trim and upholstery details, made the Cartier electronic chronometer standard, and every 1970 Mark III also featured a rear-wheel-only anti-lock braking system called SureTrack. Not traction control, not modern ABS, but a real early stab at electronically preventing lockup under hard braking down to about 4 miles per hour. The system used a tone wheel on the rear axle, electromagnetic sensor, and an analog electronic control module under the dash that compared wheel speed to a reference signal. If lockup was detected, the module would pulse a solenoid valve up to 5 times a second, modulating hydraulic pressure to the rear brakes only. It was the first production anti-lock system offered in an American car, beating Mercedes to the US market by a year, and it was standard equipment on every 1970 Mark III. This giant velvet sledgehammer of a luxury coupe had rear anti-lock brakes in 1970. That's exactly the kind of thing that makes old luxury cars fascinating. They're full of advanced ideas deployed by companies absolutely convinced that complexity itself was a feature. According to the sales brochure, this early ABS system is computer controlled. Now, I think they're being generous because there's no code being executed. It looks to be a series of logic gates, frequency converters, and comparators that do the right thing, but calling it a computer is a bit of a stretch. These year-over-year improvements are why the 1970 and 71 cars are often considered especially desirable among the Mark IIIs. The running changes had settled in, parts consistency had improved, and they'd gotten some of the best equipment. The 1970 model year also saw upholstery revisions and options like a sliding sunroof, tilt wheel, power seat, and upgraded radio gear, all layered atop what was already one of the most fully realized personal luxury cars in America. But none of that was the real hook yet. The real hook here is the original owner. One of the things that's kind of unusual on these cars is that they could carry a personalized owner plaque, and this one had enough identifying information on it that I began to pull at the threads. The plaque listed a man named Tuttle, and between that, the car's paperwork, and the delivery city and state, I started digging. The first thing I found was his obituary. Now that's a strange moment, because you start reaching out and researching a machine, and then suddenly the machine opens a door into somebody else's actual life. The car stops being a mere object and starts becoming evidence. Evidence of taste, of discipline, of money, of family, of a moment in American life when a 39-year-old telephone executive could walk into Main Lincoln Mercury in San Antonio and order one of the finest personal luxury cars in the country. The order was placed on August 25, 1969. The car carried an MSRP of about $9,100, which in modern money is crowding six figures depending on how you calculate it. And that's important context, so these cars were not merely expensive Fords. They were status cars. Carefully engineered, lavishly equipped status cars sold by a Lincoln division newly emboldened by the Mark III's success. The Mark III had launched at roughly $6,700 for 1969, undercutting the Cadillac Eldorado while still projecting every bit as much gravitas, and it worked. It became a profitable flagship and, in its first year, reportedly outsold the Eldorado, which had been the whole point. Tuttle's car was initially scheduled for a build in October, but it came early. It was shipped on September 29th and delivered on October 20th, 1969. Then Mr. Tuttle spent the next 36 years doing something I find almost impossible to comprehend and deeply admirable. He preserved it. He washed it. He waxed it. He maintained it. He took it for the odd Sunday drive or summer vacation. And somehow, in 36 years, he only put 9,000 miles on it. Now, I understand low-mileage cars. I bought a BMW M3 in 2003 that I still own, and it now has about 14,000 miles on it. But that's over roughly half the span. 9,000 miles in 36 years is a different level of restraint. That is not ownership as transportation, that is stewardship. However he arrived at that relationship with the car, whether through temperament or circumstance, the result is the same. He preserved a piece of American automotive history in a condition that the market simply cannot manufacture after the fact. They're only original once, and they don't stay that way forever, but this one somehow did. Eventually, I tracked down Tuttle's eldest son through the obituary, and after an only slightly ridiculous cold email adventure involving corporate gatekeepers and a side quest into the thrilling world of email demarketers, we got connected. And then the story became real in a way that paperwork alone never can. Mr. Tuttle had retired from Southwestern Bell after a 42-year career that included the transition to SS7 switching systems. I have a special affection for that detail because it places him in a world of infrastructure, of reliability, and invisible complexity. He retired as chief of network maintenance, overseeing several central offices, and I'm told he never took a sick day in 42 years. Now that is either just astonishingly admirable or a level of personal uptime commitment that modern HR would classify as a firmware bug in most employees. Either way, it tells you something about the man. And suddenly the car begins to make perfect sense. Of course he bought a Mark III. Of course he ordered it very carefully. And of course he kept every document. Of course he maintained it exactly. Because this wasn't just a Lincoln. It was the material expression of a particular kind of mid-century American competence. Serious job, serious standards, serious car. The Mark III could be considered at its core an engineer's car. What really started to pull me in, though, was the option sheet, because this is the point where the car stops being a generic Mark III and starts becoming Mr. Tuttle's Mark III. That's one of the things I love about old factory paperwork. If you know how to read it, it's almost like the source code. It tells you what the car is, yes, but more importantly, it tells you what somebody else thought was important on the day they sat down with a salesman and started checking boxes. And in this case, the choices are fascinating because they don't read like the order form for some flashy guy who just wanted the biggest, glossiest coupe in the showroom. They read like the order form for a very methodical person who wanted the best version of the car that he intended to keep for a very long time. And cosmetically, he got the obvious things right. Triple black is one of those combinations that can either look sinister and elegant or like a hearse for a nightclub owner. But on a Mark III, it absolutely works. Even so, it was a highly uncommon combination back in that day, accounting for only 1% to 2% of the production. The black full vinyl roof gives it even more formality, almost making the roof float visually above the body. The gold metallic paint stripes are such a wonderfully period touch, especially for Texas, because they add just enough contrast to let the car announce itself without compromising its overall restraint. This wasn't a loud color combination, but it wasn't anonymous either. It had presence. It was dignified, but it knew it was dignified. Then you get to the comfort and convenience options, and the picture gets a little clearer. Power seats, reclining passenger seat, split bench seat, tilt steering wheel, remote trunk release, complete tinted glass, power door locks, automatic climate control, AM/FM stereo radio, automatic headlight dimmer. This is not a stripped-down big coupe. This is somebody saying very explicitly, if I'm going to spend this kind of money on a Lincoln, I want it to do Lincoln things. I remember what that meant in 1970. Today, if you buy an expensive car, there's a sort of a baseline expectation that everything will be powered, climate controlled, electronically assisted, and generally eager to please. But in 1970, every one of those little conveniences still carried meaning. They were still mechanical devices. They weren't just appliances yet. They were luxury. Power door lock said this is a serious car. Automatic temperature control said that the car manages your environment for you, which still sounded vaguely like science fiction to a lot of buyers. Automatic headlight dimming is one of my favorites because it's such a specific form of luxury. It's not flashy, it doesn't impress the neighbors, it just quietly reduces one more tiny friction in the process of driving at night by using a photocell to dip the high beams. That is exactly the kind of option a certain kind of technical person loves. Not because it's glamorous, but because it is clever. And then there's the part of the build that really caught my eye because buried among the luxury gear is a surprisingly set of serious mechanical choices. This car was ordered with the optional high-torque axle ratio, traction-lock differential, and what Lincoln described as the cross-country ride package, which is their code for heavy-duty suspension. The higher torque rear axle setup was basically a gearing choice that favored the kind of effortless off-the-line shove and relaxed authority that suited a big 460-powered personal luxury coupe. Not performance in the muscle car sense, not quarter-mile heroics, but something more subtle and arguably more appropriate, making the car feel unstressed, responsive, and composed in real-world use. It's hard not to love a big 460 backed by a C6 transmission and a Ford 9-inch traction-lock differential. And that is such an interesting combination to me because it tells you that Tuttle wasn't just buying image, he was buying specification. The traction-lock differential is especially revealing. For anybody who's not immersed in old Detroit terminology, that's Ford's limited slip differential, the thing that helps power both wheels instead of putting power just to one of them and letting that tire go up in smoke the moment conditions get less than ideal. On a big luxury coupe, that might sound almost comical at first until you remember what this car actually is. It's a Mark III and it's got 460 cubic inches, 500 foot-pounds of torque, and the mass of a small moon. If you live in the real world and not in a brochure, then limited slip differentials make perfect sense. It improves traction on wet pavement. It improves stability when pulling away from a stop. It makes the car more sure-footed on uneven surfaces.
Would you like me to explain?
I would love to hear this.
It's a limited slip differential which distributes power equally to both the right and left tires.
It's the option you buy when you like the idea of all that torque being managed intelligently. And to me, that feels very tech guy. Because a certain kind of engineer, operator, or systems-minded person doesn't just buy options emotionally, he buys them architecturally. He thinks in terms of failure modes. He thinks in terms of the edge cases. He thinks, I have this much engine, I have this much weight, I may encounter rain, bad pavement, or gravel, and I would prefer that the drivetrain behave predictably. Now, that's not a hot rodder mindset, that's a network maintenance mindset. That's someone who spends his career ensuring that complex systems keep working under less than ideal conditions. The optional axle ratio is another one that I find revealing. People hear optional gears and assume the buyer must have wanted to drag race his Lincoln, which is a delightful image, but probably not what was going on here. In a car like the Mark III, the choice of gearing was really about the car's character. They changed how the whole machine went about its business. A slightly better rear-end axle ratio could make the big 460 feel even more effortless in traffic, more responsive at part throttle, more willing when passing, and more in tune with the kind of smooth, immediate surge that luxury buyers expected. It wasn't about turning the car into a muscle machine. It was about making sure that nearly 5,000 pounds of leather, steel, and sound deadener never felt caught flat-footed. Even the radial white sidewall tires are telling. That wasn't just a styling decision. Radials were part of the modern, more technically sophisticated way of specifying a car at the time. Better ride, better wear, better road manners, and superior wet weather grip compared to the bias ply tires that were still the default. If you were the sort of person who was paying attention to engineering progress, that box would make sense too. And when you pair those mechanical choices with the luxury options, the portrait that emerges is incredibly specific. This is a man who wanted comfort, yes. He wanted quiet, ease, elegance, but also status. But he also appeared to have wanted robustness, competence, and correctness. He wasn't just ordering a Lincoln as jewelry. He was ordering it the way a serious person orders a machine that he expects to live with. In fact, the whole build has the feel of somebody who understood infrastructure, which is exactly, of course, what he did for a living. Of course, the telephone network guy would appreciate systems that quietly do their job. And of course, he might like automatic climate control because maintaining a stable environment is what good systems do. And of course, he might appreciate automatic headlight dimming because it is literally feedback control in the service of comfort. And of course, he might order a limited slip differential and a carefully chosen axle ratio because those are exactly the kind of invisible under-the-skin decisions that make a machine behave better in the real world. A lot of people buy cars from the outside in. They fall in love with the silhouette, the badge, the color, and the story. They want the car to tell about them. Now, Tuttle may have been doing some of that too, because nobody orders a triple black Mark III by accident. But the more I look at the actual paperwork, the more I think he also bought from the inside out. He wanted the hidden features, the systems, the things that wouldn't necessarily reveal themselves on a showroom walk-around, but that would matter every single time he used the car. And maybe that's part of why the car survived the way it did. Because if you order a car that carefully, if you think through the details that deeply, if you choose the options the way an engineer specifies a piece of equipment, there's a decent chance that you're going to care for it the same way too. You're going to keep the paperwork. You're going to service it. You're going to notice when something changes. You're going to preserve it not because you're trying to create a museum piece, but because preserving things correctly is simply how your brain works. And that's what I find so compelling here. The option list is not just trivia, it's character development. This Lincoln wasn't merely a luxury coupe with some extra cost equipment. It was a highly specific answer to a personal question asked back in 1969. If you are a 39-year-old telephone executive in San Antonio at the height of America's big car age, and you decide to buy one of the finest personal luxury cars in the country, what exactly do you want that car to be? Now, Mr. Tuttle answered that question in a way that was elegant, technically literate, and quietly serious. And 50-odd years later, you can still read the answer right there on the build sheet. And that's the thing I didn't expect when I first saw that video. See, I thought I was chasing a design. What I was really chasing was continuity, because the Mark III itself represents continuity as well. It reaches backward to the Continental and to the Mark II with its formal luxury and curated exclusivity, while also pointing forward into the 1970s world of personal luxury coupes that Detroit would spend the next decade inflating into ever more elaborate rolling living rooms. To understand why the Mark III mattered, you have to go back to the original Continental, because Lincoln didn't invent this idea in 1969. They were reviving it. The first Continental was created in 1939 as a one-off personal car for Edsel Ford, shaped with designer Bob Gregoire after Edsel came back from Europe wanting something lower, longer, and more tailored than the usual American luxury car. The reaction was so strong that Ford put it into production, and what began as a custom personal car became one of the most admired American designs of the era. Now, when people talk about the original Continental, they're not just talking about transportation. They're talking about one of those rare cars that seem to define taste itself. And that matters because Continental wasn't originally just a model name in the casual modern sense. It was an idea. It meant the car in the Lincoln orbit that stood a little above the rest, the one meant to carry the most style, the most prestige, the most intention. In today's language, we'd probably call that a halo car or a flagship car for the Mark, meaning the car whose job is not to just merely sell itself, but to elevate the entire brand around it. It's the car that tells the world that this is what we're capable of when nobody else tells us to be sensible. Then in the mid-1950s, Ford decided to revisit that idea in a much more formal way with the Continental Mark II. And the Mark II is one of my favorite kinds of the Detroit stories because it is at once both deeply admirable and kind of insane. This is not just some fancy Lincoln coupe. Ford actually spun off Continental as its own auto division, built the Mark II as an ultra-premium personal luxury car, and aimed it at the kind of buyer who might otherwise be looking at a Rolls-Royce Silver Cloud or a Bentley. It was largely hand-assembled, obsessively finished, and priced at nearly $10,000 in 1956, which made it the most expensive American production car of its day. In modern terms, this was Ford deciding that if it was going to build a prestige car, it was going to build one with absolutely no interest in appearing restrained about it. What makes the Mark II so important in this story is not just that it was expensive, but why it was expensive. It existed to prove something. It was there to show that Ford could build a world-class luxury car with clean design, superb materials, and almost absurd attention to fit and finish. It was less a product planner's car than a corporate declaration. The trouble, of course, is that hand-built declarations of excellence are not always compatible with the accounting department. Ford reportedly lost money on every Mark II it sold, and after 1957, the standalone Continental division was folded back into the company. So the Mark II established a mythology, but not a sustainable business model. And that's really the backdrop for the 1969 Mark III. Because by then, Detroit had changed, the market had changed, and the idea had changed. Lincoln no longer needed to build a quasi-bespoke lost leader for a tiny set of industrialists and movie stars. What it needed was a modern personal luxury coupe that could capture the spirit of the old Continental mystique while actually making money and competing head-on with Cadillac's Eldorado. And so the Mark III was, in a sense, the practical reboot of an impractical dream. It took the old Continental formula of elegance, exclusivity, and unmistakable presence, and then translated it into a late 1960s corporate America. Big torque, big style, a formal roofline, hidden headlamps, rich interiors, and enough visual authority to make an office parking lot feel like a board meeting. That's why I think the Mark III lands so well with people even today. It isn't just a handsome old Lincoln. It represents Lincoln trying for the second time to answer a very specific question. What does the top of the line look like if you want to build not just a luxury car, but the luxury car? Not the practical one. The one whose real purpose is to embody the brand. The one that exists partly to be bought, but also to be admired. The original Continental did that as a personal car turned production classic. The Mark II almost did it as a hand-built statement of intent. And the Mark III did it by bringing that same aura down to earth just enough that a successful, serious, and technically minded buyer like Mr. Tuttle could actually walk into a Lincoln Mercury dealership and order one for himself. The Mark III is the pivot point. It still has restraint. It still has discipline. It still has the proportions and the chrome and the seriousness of the hand-drawn era. But it's already introducing the formula that would define the segment. Big engine, dramatic styling, rich materials, technological showmanship, and the promise that what you're really buying is not just speed, but arrival. And that is why I think I fell so hard for this car despite being a dyed-in-the-wool GM guy. Because the Mark III is not a muscle car trying to be classy. It's a luxury car that fully understood that elegance without force is just decoration. It has presence. It has intent. It has one of the best front ends that Detroit ever committed to steel. And in triple black with a leather interior and original paperwork and 12,000 miles, it stops being merely handsome and starts being almost cinematic. So yes, somewhere along the line, I fell in love with the Lincoln. Not just because of what it is, but because of how improbably it survived. Because of the man who ordered it. Because of the son who remembered it. Because of the paperwork, the plaque, the detective story, and the weird chain of digital breadcrumbs that led from an old photo to a real car owned by a real family with a real history. And because every now and then, if you are lucky, the object at the center of the search actually deserves the search. The 1970 Lincoln Continental Mark III did. And honestly, that may just be the rarest option of all. Thanks for joining me out here in the shop today. I'm mostly in this for the subs and likes, so I'd be honored if you consider leaving me one of each before you go today. And if you're already subscribed, thank you. In the meantime and in between time, I hope to see you next time, right here in Dave's Garage.